On August 29, 1994, in the quiet dorms of Winton, Virginia, an extraordinary incident unfolded. At around 5 a.m., while it was still dark, a postman noticed dense black smoke coming from a nearby house. Concerned for any potential occupants, he decided to stop and investigate. Knocking on the front door yielded no response, and he was unable to access the back entrance. In urgency, he ran to alert his neighbors and called 911. Within minutes, police and fire crews arrived on the scene to confront a fully engulfed first floor. As they breached the door, they were hit by a strong odor of gas, suggesting it had been deliberately used to intensify the flames. After battling the blaze and finally gaining control, firefighters tragically discovered 4 bodies inside, marking a devastating end to a horrific morning in the small town. The victims of the disaster were found in different rooms and had suffered severe burns. To identify the bodies, investigators needed help from a medical expert. They determined that on the sofa of the first floor lay 37-year-old Therese Hodges. Only the lower part of her hair remained. Her shorts and hair were found on the stairs, suggesting that a struggle had begun there. In the bedroom, the head of 41-year-old Blaine Hodges was discovered, with the body partially hidden under a pile of clothing and ripped on the side. In the second bedroom on the second floor, 11-year-old Winter and 3-year-old Anna were found lying together in bed, tightly clasped. Both girls were the daughters of the married couple who had perished in the fire. Initially, the investigation suggested that this was the case. However, the coroner's findings were more troubling. They determined that the victims had not died from the effects of the fire. Rather, they were all killed before the flames consumed the house. Although Teresa was deceased, her neck bore specific marks indicating a struggle. Her body had burned the most, suggesting that the fire had started next to her. During the investigation, it became clear that after being incapacitated, the woman had been doused with gasoline and set on fire. Both of the family's children were shot in the head, and Blaine suffered the same fate. Bullets from a .22 caliber weapon were recovered from the bodies of the 3 victims. The weapon was found near Blaine's head, along with an empty gasoline canister. The crime scene suggested that a man had, for some reason, turned on his wife and children before deciding to destroy everything by setting it ablaze. He allegedly poured gasoline on himself and around the area, then shot himself in the head. However, family and friends of the couple rejected this narrative. They believed Blaine had no reason to cruelly eliminate his family and take his own life. He was known to be a loving husband and father. Detectives decided to investigate Blaine's background more thoroughly. They quickly discovered that he had been facing significant problems in recent times. In 1991, Blaine was arrested by the Postal Department for the theft of $4,500. 2 years later, he was arrested again and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Additionally, he was required to pay a double penalty. During the appeals process, he was forced to remain incarcerated for the entire duration. After the appeal was denied, he faced serious financial difficulties and was unable to pay the restitution. Detectives considered that these financial troubles could have provided a motive for him to kill his loved ones and then take his own life. However, as the investigation progressed, detectives began to find inconsistencies that contradicted this theory. One notable detail was the absence of the barrel from the revolver found near his body. It had been removed, raising doubts about whether the weapon could have been used in the manner suggested. Subsequent forensic analysis confirmed that the internal configuration of the barrel did not match the bullets recovered from the victims. Furthermore, there was no sign of accelerants from the fire, which raised additional questions about how the blaze was started. Additionally, investigators found cut telephone lines, suggesting an attempt to prevent anyone from calling the police or firefighters. It seemed illogical for a man who intended to kill himself and his family to sever communication in such a manner. Despite this evidence, when news of the deaths was released, there was no mention that it could have been a murder or even a voluntary act of self-harm. The reports only indicated that the family of 4 died due to a tragic incident. However, evidence supporting the theory of a third party's involvement was still being gathered. The possibility of murder was not initially considered. The family was not wealthy, and this was well known in their community. They had no obvious enemies, and the neighborhood was generally quiet, calm, and safe, with a low crime rate. Detectives found it hard to believe that a stranger was responsible. They leaned towards the notion that the crime was motivated by personal reasons, suggesting that someone close to the family could have been involved. The most significant insights came from the medical experts' conclusions, particularly regarding 2 critical points. First, there was suspicion surrounding the method of murder of Theresa. Investigators needed to understand why she was killed differently than the others. As mentioned earlier, Theresa was murdered, while the other family members were also victims. The mother and the girls were killed between 2 o'clock and 5 a.m. Notably, medical experts determined that Blaine had died long before his wife and daughters. He was killed first. This was a crucial detail. His murder occurred a few hours prior to the deaths of the others, indicating that Blaine could not have been responsible for the deaths of his loved ones. It became evident that the Hodges family had a hidden enemy. To identify this person, investigators decided to speak with the relatives and friends of the couple. This could also help reconstruct the events leading up to the crime. Theresa's mother recounted that the day before the tragedy, the Hodges family went fishing, and on the day of the crime, Theresa attended a conference in a neighboring city. They had left their daughters in the care of Theresa's family, who lived nearby. Theresa's mother also mentioned that after Blaine lost his job and faced financial difficulties, the couple decided to try their luck by selling products through mergers and acquisitions. After that, many people talked about the potential income they hoped to earn from this activity, even encouraging their neighbors to join the company. It was mentioned that on the day of the tragedy, a guest named Marshall L. Roy was supposed to visit. He also worked in M&A and wanted to test a cleaning product to remove stains. However, Theresa's mother was unaware of this meeting. This information piqued the detectives' interest, prompting them to interview Marshall. When the detectives met with him, Marshall confirmed that he had indeed visited the Hodges family but noted nothing unusual. He recalled going down to the basement with 11-year-old Winter to demonstrate the cleaning product. Marshall mentioned that when he arrived at the Hodges home, there was a friend there who was painting the door. He felt uncomfortable about the young girl being in the basement with an unfamiliar man, but he did not witness anything out of the ordinary. After their visit, Marshall returned home and the women agreed to call later and arranged to meet the following day. Nothing indicated that they were expecting any problems. The whole family was still alive. However, detectives began to notice strange occurrences. When Theresa called her friend to clarify their plans, she provided her phone number. but it ended up being connected to a payphone at a gas station. Therese was indeed able to reach this number and discuss their trips, but it was unclear why she suddenly chose to use the payphone. The answer became evident. At that moment, the telephone lines in her home had already been cut. Consequently, Therese was unaware of what was happening and assumed the phone was simply broken, prompting her to use another method to contact her friend. This theory was quickly supported by other friends of Therese, who confirmed that she had complained about issues with her phone that day. She was frustrated with the phone problems. However, the timing and details provided by witnesses varied significantly. According to the general timeline, the next morning the family missed their visit to church, which was unthinkable for them. The Hodges family was very religious. According to their plans, a meeting of the M&A participants was to be held at their home. However, when the guests arrived, they found a note on the door from Therese stating that the meeting had been cancelled. This raised suspicions as the note seemed odd. The investigators later obtained a copy of this note signed by Therese, in which she apologized and explained that the family had urgent matters to attend to and had left unexpectedly. It was likely that they were already dead by that time. With so much conflicting information, the police needed a reliable source to help piece everything together. Based on Therese's mother's recommendation, detectives decided to track down a man named Erl Bramblet. He was the best friend of the family, so close that the children referred to him as Mr. Earl. Naturally, he would likely know more about the couple than anyone else. At that time, Earl worked at a printing company and was supposed to be at work, but the detectives were unable to locate him. They sent a message to Earl's colleague requesting that he call the station as soon as he arrived at work. That day, Earl responded to the detectives and agreed to meet at 5 p.m. After finishing work, he arrived at the station. When informed about the deaths of his close friends, the 4 members of the Hodges family, he appeared deeply upset. He even expressed anger, insisting that the police needed to find and punish the murderer. This statement immediately caught the detectives' attention, as there had been no indication in the media or initial reports suggesting that the family was murdered. Up until that point, it was widely believed that they had died in an accident, and the notion of a voluntary act of self-harm had not even been considered. Noticing the detectives' surprised reactions, Earl attempted to clarify his comments. He claimed he didn't know whether they had been murdered or not, but during their conversation he revealed several key details about the crime that only someone with knowledge of the events could know, particularly regarding the circumstances surrounding the deaths. Earl claimed that he had been killed, specifically mentioning that they had been burned at a gas station, which raised concerns about his involvement in the tragedy. This assertion made the detectives suspicious of him. Following this, they decided to determine when he had last seen his friends alive. Earl immediately became defensive and struggled to provide answers. The detectives tried to reassure him, explaining that they were not accusing him. They simply wanted to piece together the timeline of events. In the end, Earl admitted that he couldn't recall the last time he had seen his friends, stating it had been quite some time. This was unusual, given how close they were and how often they communicated. Additionally, one of the Hodges neighbors had already informed the police that they had seen Earl the day before the tragic events. The detectives decided to pursue this lead and showed a photo of Earl to Marshal Roy for identification. Roy and the detectives were certain they had not made a mistake. It was discovered that Earl had been the same man painting the door at the Hodges house the day before the murders. He had even confronted the eldest daughter about going to the basement with a man he did not know. His inability to recall this incident was concerning. When Earl was informed of this information, he once again became defensive and denied everything. He claimed he had no involvement and insisted that he had simply been visiting. However, the detectives were convinced that he knew more than he was letting on. It was crucial for them to prove that Earl had indeed been in the Hodges home. If they could catch him in a lie, it would help build their case against him. Law enforcement officials began interviewing neighbors. Several people reported seeing a pickup truck parked near the deceased's house in the morning before the fire. The truck left the area well before the blaze started. According to the descriptions, it matched the vehicle that Erl Bramblet drove. This meant that Earl was likely lying about having a long meeting with his friends and could have been the last person near the Hodges house before the fire started. During the investigation, detectives discovered that Earl had clocked out of work just 20 minutes after the fire began. The trip from the Hodges home to his printing company took exactly 20 minutes, suggesting that he could easily have made the journey. Realizing this discrepancy, Earl attempted to hide the time record he had created. There was another troubling detail. Earl was notably absent from the Hodges' funeral despite being known as their closest friend. All these factors raised significant concerns, positioning Erl Bramblet as the prime suspect in the murders of the 4 family members. Erl Bramblet was born in 1942 in Texas. He was a middle-aged man, a father to 5 children. His own father was an alcoholic and a cruel person who had a history of violence against the family. Despite this difficult upbringing, Earl had achieved success in both education and sports. Due to frequent transitions and changes of schools, Earl developed the ability to quickly make friends. He was friendly and easygoing. During his teenage years in high school, his mother moved with the children to escape their tyrannical father, allowing Earl to finally live in a safer environment. He found success earning a scholarship for his athletic abilities and attending college. However, despite his initial promise, he struggled to complete his degree, attending 3 different institutions but ultimately leaving each one. In 1969, Earl moved to Virginia and began working in his father's printing company. He later married and had 2 sons. During this time, he also became an assistant coach in athletics at a middle school. It was there that he met Blaine Hodges, a student whom Earl would mentor. Their relationship flourished, and they remained good friends even after Blaine graduated in 1971. Despite their significant age difference, they stayed in touch for many years. By the late 1970s, Earl's role in his father's printing business became significantly more prominent. He took on more responsibilities as his father's health declined, gradually stepping into a leadership position. A few years later, Earl took over the business entirely, hiring workers and allowing his father to take a back seat. During this time, Earl began spending more time socializing and partying. Among his colleagues was a 17-year-old girl who, after being caught for using a stolen credit card, sought revenge against Earl. She coerced her 13-year-old sister into falsely accusing him of domestic violence. Earl was arrested, but he had a solid alibi. He had been out of town that day. The judge reprimanded the police for not presenting sufficient evidence to proceed with the case. Despite these challenges, Earl continued to run the business successfully, earning a substantial income and traveling across the country. However, his travels often appeared unsettling. Despite his financial means, he lived a frugal lifestyle, staying in the cheapest hotels or sometimes sleeping in his pickup truck while driving from city to city. Investigators noted that in the printing company there were always many young girls and boys much younger than Earl. One of these was a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Thamey who lived in the same neighborhood as a 35-year-old woman. Thamey often spent time at the typography, along with Earl's wife Mary, who had two younger sisters. The girls were close in age and they regularly met. On February 7th, Thamey and her sister, Angela left their house to go to a lesson. However, instead of heading to school, they decided to take a detour and visit the city centre. They did not return home that day. The girls had a history of such adventures, so their family did not immediately report their absence to the police, hoping they would return on their own. However, as the day passed without any sign of the girls, their relatives grew increasingly worried and went to search for them. Given that this was not the first time the teenagers had gone missing, the police took their report less seriously. Officers suggested that the parents return home and wait for the girls to come back, deeming the search a waste of time and resources. In the end, no one actively searched for Thamey and Angela, and their case remained unsolved for many years. When Earl was brought in for questioning regarding the murder of the Hodges family, detectives noticed his connection to one of the missing girls, who had been 17 years old at the time of her disappearance. They observed that Earl often surrounded himself with young people who were clearly much younger than him, which raised further suspicions. When the detectives voiced their concerns about his interest in schoolgirls, Earl became defensive. He claimed he had no idea what happened to the missing girls. However, he did admit that he had spent time with Thamey, attributing their relationship to personal issues he was facing, including a financial crisis and a troubled marriage. At that time, he was dealing with the stress of a potential divorce and child support payments for two children, which had brought him closer to the young girl. Despite these revelations, Earl continued to deny any involvement in the murders of the Hodges family or the disappearance of the schoolgirls. In the end, no one actively searched for Thamey and Angela, and their case remained unsolved for many years. When Earl was brought in for questioning regarding the murder of the Hodges family, detectives noticed his connection to one of the missing girls, who had been 17 years old at the time of her disappearance. They observed that Earl often surrounded himself with young people who were clearly much younger than him, which raised further suspicions. When the detectives voiced their concerns about his interest in schoolgirls, Earl became defensive. He claimed he had no idea what happened to the missing girls. However, he did admit that he had spent time with Thamey, attributing their relationship to personal issues he was facing, including a financial crisis and a troubled marriage. At that time, he was dealing with the stress of a potential divorce and child support payments for two children, which had brought him closer to the young girl. Despite these revelations, Earl continued to deny any involvement in the murders of the Hodges family or the disappearance of the schoolgirls. On the third day of the investigation into the murder of the Hodges family, Earl once again avoided talking to the detectives. When they attempted to reach him, he didn't answer their calls. His brother informed them that he had seen Earl at the hotel on the night of the murders, suggesting he might have been involved. When police checked Earl's motel room, They found a suicide note indicating he was depressed and distressed by the authorities' presence. Although he eventually agreed to come to the police station that day, he failed to show up. The detectives returned to the motel to find Earl's room locked and no one answered when they knocked. Concerned he might have gone through with his plan to take his own life, the hotel administrator suggested they use a spare key, fearing they might find another body. To their surprise, when they entered the room, it was empty. Earl had left, but only for about half a day. When he returned, he was visibly upset about the police's presence and even attempted to provoke them into arresting him for murder. The detectives had to act quickly. They had already obtained a search warrant for the hotel where Earl was staying, as well as for his vehicle. During the search, they discovered a notebook filled with numerous notes related to criminal activities. They found 4 empty gun holsters and a .22 caliber pistol, which matched the bullets used to kill the victims. Additionally, the search revealed that Earl possessed only criminal novels and books on criminology. The discovery of these items occurred in front of Earl, who seemed shocked that he hadn't been able to dispose of the evidence. Despite this, the police did not detain him, as they found no specific evidence directly linking him to the murders. The gun was sent for ballistic analysis, but taking advantage of the situation, Earl left the city the next day. He had told friends he was going to visit his sister in Indiana. Indeed, he arrived at her home, but his whereabouts became increasingly concerning. Earl was visibly upset during his visit. His sister, concerned, asked if he had an alibi for the night, when the entire Hodges family was killed and burned. Earl insisted that he had indeed been at the Hodges house until about midnight, but claimed he was not in any trouble. He explained that he hesitated to tell the detectives about leaving the house so late, because he feared it would make him a suspect in the murders. His sister, however, was skeptical of his story. She knew all too well that Earl had struggled with substance abuse issues for years, which had caused discomfort in their home during his visits. She felt uneasy about his presence and worried about the potential implications. Earl's insistence on not informing the police about his visit only heightened her suspicions. After he left, she contacted law enforcement and shared everything she knew, firmly believing in his involvement in the tragic fate of the Hodges family. During her conversation with the detectives, Earl's sister inadvertently recalled 2 boxes that her brother had brought over a year ago. He had asked her not to open them and simply to keep them stored. Given her growing concerns about his involvement in the Hodges case, she decided to bring the boxes to the sheriff's office, thinking they might be connected to Therese and her friend, who had been missing. Upon opening the boxes, the sheriff's department discovered about 60 audio cassettes, hundreds of photographs, and a foot which, based on its size and color, appeared to belong to a young girl. While the detectives did not initially find a direct connection to the missing girls, Earl's sister believed the foot could belong to her daughter, who had been killed. All the contents were sent for forensic examination. The detectives began listening to the audio cassettes, which contained a disjointed journal recorded by Earl around 1992. He'd taken his tape recorder with him everywhere. As they listened, the police started to suspect that Earl might be suffering from paranoia, possibly related to drug use. The recordings revealed his fixation on Blaine's alleged theft and the problems it caused. During his time off work, Earl began to formulate a bizarre theory about a trap. He developed an unhealthy interest in Winter, convinced that she could be using her friendship with his daughter as bait. Earl believed that Winter was intentionally trying to manipulate him, viewing her as a clever and calculating girl akin to a spy like Mata Hari. This irrational notion surfaced during a particularly unstable period in Blaine's life. Despite the absurdity of his thoughts, there was an unsettling seriousness to his fixation on his daughter's friend. His writings during this time reflected a delusional attempt to justify his inappropriate feelings toward an 11-year-old girl, couched in ridiculous conspiracy theories. In pursuit of more evidence, the police conducted a search in the area where Erl worked. They discovered a couple of suspicious figures, too small and too large, that resembled the marks left by gunshots. Notably, one of the larger figures had an imprint consistent with the injuries of the deceased mother. These coincidences did not appear random. The details regarding the victim's injuries were confidential, accessible only to the police, yet Erl refused to comment on them. Furthermore, investigators found another .22 caliber pistol in Erl's pickup. Ballistic analysis confirmed it was the same weapon used to kill the Hodges family. On the bed of the deceased girl, they discovered a hair matching the DNA profile of Bramblet. With this evidence, the police finally had sufficient grounds to file charges against Erl. However, he was nowhere to be found. It later emerged that he had fled to Starenburg, South Carolina, where he lived for 2 years. He purchased a house and adopted a small dog, caring for it diligently. Every day he would visit a local shop where he bought dry beef for the dog and cheap beer for himself. He tended to his garden, planting tomatoes, and even bought a local house for his sons, starting renovations there. On July 30th, 1996, Erl was finally found and arrested. By October 1997, the trial commenced. Erl had no funds for a lawyer, so a public defender was appointed. The defense claimed that Erl suffered from psychosocial disorders, which could have led to a breakdown and tragic consequences. However, this was not supported by any expert evaluations. During the initial investigation, there were no traces of blood found. The prosecutor argued that Erl had ample opportunity to clean himself and wash his clothes in the basement of the Hodges home before setting the house on fire. Bramblet contended that all evidence against him had been fabricated, including the hair found on the bed and the gun. He insisted that his voice was misrepresented in recordings, creating the impression of his involvement with Winter. Throughout the years, Erl maintained that he was the Hodges' closest friend, helping them to the best of his abilities. During a particularly tough financial period, he even lent Blaine a printing press to help him start a mini typography business for additional income. However, Blaine ultimately rejected this idea, opting instead to sell the equipment to a church for $4,000. The court also noted that Erl had assisted the family with renovations to create a more comfortable environment for Winter, who disliked the interior of their home. The evening before the tragic events, Winter had expressed fear, stating that someone seemed to be targeting her father. Erl agreed to let her stay at their house for safety, but Therese refused to allow it, worried that Blaine would disapprove. In the aftermath, Erl speculated that there might have been enemies out to harm the Hodges family. He suggested that it could have been rivals of Therese's brother, a substance dealer who wanted to intimidate him by attacking the family. Therese's father had warned her just days before the murders to take Erl's keys away and change the locks for their safety. One of Therese's friends corroborated this, confirming that Therese had been fearful of Erl. Blaine's brother testified that Earl had shown a long-standing interest in serial murder, often reading extensively on the topic. He believed this obsession had prepared Earl for criminal behavior. During the investigation, Ranger Parker recalled seeing Therese, Winter, and Earl hunting together the day before the murders. They appeared to be in good spirits, raising questions about why Blaine, the father, was absent. It turned out he had been forced to stay home for unspecified reasons while the family enjoyed a day out with their beloved friend Earl. Additionally, several women came forward, claiming that Earl had introduced them to alcohol and drugs at a young age and had abused them. In response, the defense presented witnesses who highlighted Earl's difficult upbringing, including parents who were alcoholics and a harsh childhood marked by frequent relocations. They described his struggles with paranoia and the need to earn money from an early age. During the court proceedings, Erl Bramblet claimed that he had confessed to the murder of the Hodges family. He alleged that on the day of the incident, his parents found him at Winter's home, prompting him to kill the entire family to prevent them from reporting him to the police. Despite his confession, Earl continued to deny any involvement in the murders. As the details of the incident emerged, it was suggested that Earl had killed Blaine first upon returning home. He then attacked Therese, leaving her lifeless on the living room sofa. The two girls were found dead in their beds, confirming the brutal nature of the crime. On October 16th, Earl was convicted of murdering all 4 members of the Hodges family and was sentenced to death in Virginia. While the death penalty was later overturned, Earl was initially subject to it. He was given the option between the electric chair or lethal injection and chose the electric chair as a form of protest, believing the judgment against him was unjust. Following the trial, Earl was approached to confess to the murders of 2 missing students, Thamey and Angela. There were numerous reasons to consider Erl Bramblet guilty of the murders, yet he continued to deny his involvement. He made a peculiar statement suggesting that the teenagers had died in the fire, which many interpreted as an implicit admission of guilt regarding their murders. This statement echoed the circumstances surrounding the deaths of the Hodges family. Despite his appeals and requests for clemency from the governor, all were denied. On April 9, 2003, 61-year-old Erl Bramblet was served his last meal. He chose not to request anything specific and was given the standard prison fare, an omelette, baked potato, corn and chocolate cake. In his final words, he maintained his innocence, asserting that he had never killed anyone and that he faced death with a clear conscience. He expressed gratitude to his close relatives before the execution took place at 9:09 p.m. that evening. The bodies of the missing girls, Thamey and Angela, have never been found. This raises the question, could Earl truly have been involved in their disappearance? Some still believe that his execution was a miscarriage of justice, leaving the real killer of the Hodges family free. If you like my work, subscribe to the channel, share this video with a like. Let's discuss this story in the comments. Thank you. Bye.